start. So we're going to talk about how matter and energy move through the environment and through different levels of the environment. Okay. We're going to look at how you're storing energy and how all living things are storing energy and how a lot is lost. And from physical science, you probably remember energy can never be lost, right? But it ends up going out into the environment as heat. You're all giving off heat right now, your little heat engines. So is your dog. If you've ever had a dog snuggle in on a cold night, you know that they're great little heat engines. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And we're going to look at how many things the environment can support. Is there a limit to how many organisms the environment can support? There is. That's the spoiler alert. So those are kind of the overall goals for the chapter. We're going to start off with the bare bones basics. The bare bones basics being this. So every single living thing on the earth is part of the biosphere. You're part of the biosphere. A maple tree, a bacteria, a blue whale, a daffodil, a coyote, a bacteria out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, a jellyfish, a coral reef, the grass in the yard, the earthworms, the birds. There are bacteria floating in the air. You're aware of this? Like up in the high atmosphere, there are bacteria. They actually very often form the seeds for precipitation because precipitation has to have a surface to condense to. So there's a whole branch of biology that studies like atmospheric bacteria. It's fascinating what people learn about. So the biosphere is the part of the earth that has life in or on it, and it goes up into the upper atmosphere, and it goes pretty far down into the earth, both in the soil and in the oceans. So the oceans are pretty deep, and there is life. Not a lot of life, mind you, but there is life all the way down to the bottom of some parts of the ocean. Those deep ocean trenches have a source of energy, and there are living things there. So all of that is part of the biosphere. You can kind of think about it as this little sort of tenuous envelope, you know? And I'm drawing it way thicker than it is. Way thicker. Because actually, if we look at, if we look at the biosphere, in truth, if the earth were the size of an apple, the biosphere would be about as thick as the skin. There's a really big planet, and there's a little tiny fraction of it that is hospitable to life in any form. Nothing lives at the center of the earth. Too hot, too dense. Nothing lives above the atmosphere of the earth. It's a vacuum. Liquids tend to immediately vaporize up there. So the area of this, we think about it in these terms. Remember we looked at that picture and I said those aren't stars, those are galaxies. So, we are on this one little tiny planet in one arm of a universe, one arm of a galaxy. And on that one little tiny planet, there is this tiny fraction of that planet that's even capable of supporting life as we know it. If you go back and watch some of the old Star Trek, we're doing that at home right now. And we just watched one last night in which there's a silicon-based life form, so none of their sensors can pick it up because it's not life as we know it. Yeah, it's possible there's life not as we know it, but here on Earth, it's a pretty narrow little band. It's this skinny little envelope where we can have life. Has anybody ever seen a picture of this before? Okay. You know what it's called, and the name's right up on the slide. This was an experimental project performed in the desert of Arizona, and I actually lived, and I think this picture is taken, can't tell if this is taken from the south or the north. I lived up there. So I lived in a place called Mount Lemmon, and this was on the back side of the Santa Catalinas, which was the range that I lived in for a while. You could actually see this if you drove down the backside road of the mountain. You could see the domes of Biosphere 2. So why did they call it Biosphere 2? What was it, first of all? It was an attempt to create a self-contained living environment. So this thing was sealed up tight. No air was supposed to go in or out. No water went in or out. No nutrients went in or out. They couldn't call out for pizza. No food came in and out. No waste went in or out. Poop does pile up, but it also decomposes. They had an artificial ocean in there. They had rainforests. They had all kinds of different biomes, different natural environments. And the goal was for the Biospheres, the Bionauts, I think they called them at the time. And this was conducted in the mid-90s. No, early, because I was there 93 to 94, 95, and it was constructed. So yeah, this was early 90s. The goal was, I think there were 10 or 11 people, and they were going to go in there, and they were going to be shut up for 1 year. And they were going to grow all their own food, reprocess all their own wastes. So all the nutrients that they pooped out, they had animals in there, all the nutrients the animals pooped out would all decompose, become part of the soil. That soil would grow more food. They would consume that. I mean, that's the way it works. You understand that, right? That's what happens. They had an atmosphere in there that mimicked Earth's atmosphere, so roughly 70% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, descending percentages of CO2, water vapor, argon, all that stuff. And in theory, they had done the calculations that there would be, hey, how hard can it be? The Earth's doing it, right? How tough can it be? All we get in is energy from the sun. Everything else is on this planet. All the atoms that are ever going to be on this planet are already here. I mean, we get the occasional stray meteor or something that crashes to Earth, but all the matter that we're dealing with is here. It's a closed system. So how hard could it be? They had plants, which would take in the carbon dioxide that the humans and the animals breathed out, and would put out what? Somebody mentioned this in there. What do you know? Would put out oxygen. They had bacteria in the ocean. They had bacteria in the soil. They had really done their research. They thought that they had all the little cogs and wheels. Do you remember that phrase from Sand County Almanac? I'm going to keep saying it. I'll have to. Boy, I don't have it committed to memory. The last word in ignorance is the man who says of a plant or an animal, what good is it? If the land mechanism as a whole is good, then every part of it is good, whether we understand it or not. If the biota, over the course of eons, has built something we like but do not understand, who but a fool would discard the seemingly useless parts? To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. Well, in the biosphere, they didn't fully understand every cog and wheel, every little tiny piece of this amazing chemical, biological machine that is the biosphere. And in less than 3 months, their oxygen levels dipped so low that the humans inside were threatened with death. And to save the lives of the bionauts, they actually imported oxygen. They allowed that to happen. And I forget what the final explanation was. It was something like they had underestimated the amount of decomposition that was going to occur with soil. Basically, what sunk the whole gas balance thing was bacteria in the soil. There were bacteria using oxygen, and they didn't account for how much oxygen those bacteria would use. And that was a little tiny piece, a little teeny tiny cog, and yet oxygen levels in there dropped so low that people were on the verge of death. Tiny little piece, those bacteria. But they nearly killed 10 people, and all the animals and everything else in there. So it's amazing that we have this little tiny envelope of life on this little rocky planet, third rock from the sun, an arm of the Milky Way, and we can't replicate it. We can't reverse engineer it. It's so complicated, we don't understand all the pieces yet. I find that amazing. Well, the biosphere is a big idea, and to talk about ecology, we need to use a smaller, more manageable unit. So within that larger biosphere, we tend to talk more about the littler units that are called ecosystems. And an ecosystem it's a specific area, and when we're talking about an ecosystem, we're talking about all the living and non-living things that are found in that place. So living things are biotic factors. This is one of your vocabulary words. Something that affects something else is a factor. Like, what are you gonna do Friday night? Well, the fact that I'm grounded is kind of a factor in that. You know, are you gonna drive to Canada tomorrow? Well, the fact that I don't have a license or a car is kind of going to play a factor in that. A factor is something that influences something. In an ecosystem, the biotic factors are those things that influence other things and are living. So in Biosphere 2, the biotic factor that kind of crashed the atmosphere was what? Bacteria. Little teeny tiny bacteria. They're a biotic factor. The non-living things that affect other things that are found in a place, that can include things like the nutrients in the soil, the amount of precipitation you get, how much water is available to you. Water is not a living thing, but no living thing can survive without it. The habitat that's available to you, the shelter that's available to you can be an abiotic factor. But with abiotic factors, we usually talk about things like weather, precipitation, temperature. Temperature is a non-living factor, and yet it definitely influences living things. Oops. So within every ecosystem that we can talk about, and we can talk about some pretty small ecosystems. We can talk about a pond as an ecosystem, or a meadow as an ecosystem, or a particular forest as an ecosystem. We tend to try to keep it to sort of manageable units. We wouldn't talk about, the Northeast United States as a single ecosystem. In some ways it is, but it's a little bit too broad for most definitions. We try to keep ecosystems a little bit smaller than that. But every ecosystem is made up of communities. And community is a word that you probably are very familiar with. You might live in the community of Calcutta. You might visit the community of Lisbon. We think about communities in human terms. And community in the biological sense is a little bit different, because when we think about it in human terms, we're thinking about where we live. And the community comprises the buildings and the people and the parks and the churches and the grocery stores and the post office and the parking lot and the roads. In biology, a community is made up of only living things. Okay? The community does not include any of the non-living things. So a community is all living things. The non-living things are not part of the community. They're separate from the community. Not part of the community. The community is all the populations of species that live in one place. Okay? The community is all the populations, all the different species that live in one place. So in a forest ecosystem, the community might be made up of a population of white-tailed deer, a population of raccoons, a population of rabbits, a population of bacteria, a population of Scotch pines, a population of red maple trees, a population of sycamore trees, a population of black rat snakes, a population of earthworms, a whole collection of populations of bacteria. Bacteria and fungus are really important in forest ecosystems. But communities are all made up of entirely living things. So, is the amount of precipitation that the forest got last year part of the community? Yes or no? No, because that's an abiotic factor. So it's part of the ecosystem. Yes, ma'am?
I know this is off subject, but it's
Off topic at all. The things that make up the community are the living things. The abiotic factors plus the community, that's the ecosystem. Okay, what's a population? And you guys should know this by now. We've had this on like 4 vocabulary things. All the members of a species that live in a particular place and are capable of interbreeding. Can't be different species. Have to be able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Have to live in one specific place. Why do I have this big red prohibition sign through that? Do not tell me that population is the number of something that lives in a place. That's population size. We'll talk about that in the next chapter. A population is all the members of one species that live in one place and can interbreed. It is not the number of them. Okay? Not number of individuals. Okay? It's not the number of individuals, it's all the members of a species that live in a place and can interbreed. Okay. This is sort of an example of a breakdown, and the spacing got screwed up on this. But the biosphere, remember, this is the biggest, broadest category of things there are. All the living things on the entire planet Earth, above, below, in the atmosphere, in the soil, in the oceans, in the lakes and the rivers and the trees. But we could look at an ecosystem, a little unit of that biosphere, is something like the pond at the park, or the Chesapeake Bay, or Lake Erie is an ecosystem. The community in that pond is going to consist of a bunch of different populations. So there might be a population of mallards, there might be a population of snapping turtles, green frogs, bullfrogs, bluegill, bass, mosquitoes, dragonflies, northern water snakes, gilled snails. There might even be non-gilled snails, broadleaf cattails, water lilies, algae, duckweed, bacteria, all of those living things. Every species that has a population in that ecosystem is part of the community. There would be a lot more than that. We can't even begin to enumerate those. Then the population would be something like this. Gilled snails at the pond in the park. And when we specify population, we have to specify both the species and the location. If we don't do that, we're not talking about a population. We have to specify species and location. Okay. The words that you have for tomorrow for your third column are biosphere, ecosystem, biotic, abiotic, community, population. I can. Biosphere, ecosystem, biotic, actually atmosphere too. We didn't define it so much, but we talked about it. The upper atmosphere, the atmosphere where living things are, the envelope of gases around our planet. So biosphere, atmosphere, ecosystem, biotic. Basically everything down to number 8 except for number 1. So numbers 2 through 8. You should be able to define those in your own words for tomorrow. Vocab number 2 through 8. Third column. Okay? So you can start on that, and we will pick this all up tomorrow.